The westbound train wheezed to a stop at Cedar Hollow Station, its iron wheels grinding against the rails like the last breath of a dying beast. Clara Mae Donnelly pressed her face against the dusty window, watching the small frontier town emerge through the late afternoon haze. 2 years of widow's black had faded to gray on her traveling dress, and her gloved hands trembled as they clutched the worn leather satchel containing everything she owned in this world, including 47 letters from Lucas P. Wentworth. She'd read each one so many times the paper had gone soft at the creases. His penmanship was bold and sure, speaking of vast cattle ranges of skies that stretched forever, of a life rebuilt from ashes. "Come west," he'd written in his last letter dated 6 weeks prior. "Cedar Hollow needs a woman of your strength and character. I need you, Clara Mae." The platform stood empty, save for a mangy dog scratching behind its ear and an old man dozing on a bench. No Lucas. Clara gathered her carpet bag and stepped down from the train, her boots meeting the wooden planks with a hollow sound that echoed her growing unease. The September wind caught her bonnet strings, and she tasted dust and disappointment. "Ma'am?" The station master, a wiry fellow with tobacco stains on his vest, appeared at her elbow. "You waitin' on someone?" "Mr. Lucas Wentworth," she replied, lifting her chin despite the knot forming in her stomach. "He was to meet me." The man's eyebrows climbed toward his receding hairline. "Lucas, well, now that's peculiar. Saw him just this morning, heading out to the Bentley spread. Big to-do out there, announcing his engagement to the youngest Bentley girl." The world tilted slightly. Clara gripped the handle of her satchel tighter. "There must be some mistake." "No mistake, ma'am. Whole town's been talking about it for days." He scratched his jaw, studying her with curious eyes. "You kin to Lucas?" "An acquaintance," she managed, though the word tasted like ash. "Through correspondence." Understanding dawned on his weathered face, followed quickly by pity, the last thing Clara wanted or needed. She straightened her spine, a habit learned through 2 years of condolences and careful smiles. "Is there a hotel in town?" "The Sagebrush Inn, 2 blocks down Main Street. Mrs. Harriet runs a clean establishment." He paused, clearly wrestling with whether to say more. "Ma'am, if you don't mind my saying, Lucas Wentworth's got himself a reputation for writing prettier than he acts." Clara nodded once sharply. "Thank you for your candor, Mr. Jennings, ma'am. Pete Jennings." She left him standing there, his pity following her like a shadow as she made her way into town. Cedar Hollow sprawled before her, a collection of weathered storefronts, a church with a crooked steeple horses tied to hitching posts, and men who tipped their hats, but whose eyes asked questions she had no intention of answering. The Sagebrush Inn squatted on the corner like a fat hen, its yellow paint peeling in the harsh western sun. Clara pushed through the door a bell announcing her arrival to a lobby that smelled of lye soap and beef stew. The woman behind the desk looked up from her ledger, taking in Clara's traveling clothes and the weariness that clung to her like perfume. "Room for one?" "Yes." Clara set down her bags, fingers fumbling with the clasp of her small purse. She'd budgeted carefully for this journey, expecting not to need a hotel room at all. "That'll be $2 a night, meals included. How long you staying?" "I'm not certain." The admission stung. Nothing about her future was certain anymore. The woman, Mrs. Harriet, presumably softened slightly. "You can pay by the week if you're staying longer. Saves you 50 cents. Clara counted out coins for 3 nights, hoping she'd figure out her next move before the money ran out. The room key was heavy in her hand, stamped with the number 7. Lucky number 7, Thomas used to say. But Thomas was 2 years in the ground, and luck seemed to have abandoned her somewhere between Kansas and this dust-blown town. Her room overlooked Main Street. Clara sat on the narrow bed springs, creaking under her weight, and finally allowed herself to pull out Lucas's letters. His words mocked her now. "My dearest Clara, your letters are the brightest part of my days. I think of you constantly wondering what dress you'll wear when you step off that train. Together we'll build something lasting in this wild country." Lies, all lies wrapped in pretty penmanship. She'd been so careful after Thomas died, so cautious about opening her heart again. But the loneliness had been a living thing gnawing at her insides during those long Kansas nights. When her sister had shown her the advertisement, "Respectable rancher seeks correspondence with marriage-minded lady," it had seemed like Providence itself extending a hand. Clara pressed her palms against her eyes, refusing to cry. She'd shed enough tears to fill the Platte River, and what good had it done? Thomas was still dead. Kansas still held nothing for her, and now she was stranded in a town where she knew no one with barely enough money to last a fortnight. A burst of laughter from the street below drew her to the window. Cowboys were loading supplies onto a wagon, joking and shoving each other with the easy camaraderie of men who worked hard and played harder. One of them glanced up, catching sight of her in the window. He touched the brim of his hat, a gesture of respect, nothing more, before turning back to his companions. She was 28 years old. Not old, but no longer young by frontier standards. Pretty enough, Thomas had always said, with her auburn hair and green eyes that turned gray when she was sad. But pretty didn't keep you warm at night, didn't plow fields or mend fences or bring back the dead. Evening crept over Cedar Hollow like a tired old man settling into his chair. Clara unpinned her traveling hat, loosened the tight coil of her hair, and tried to think. She could wire her sister for money to return to Kansas, admit defeat, endure the whispers and knowing looks. She could find work here. Surely a town needed seamstresses or teachers or whatever else a woman could respectably do. Or she could confront Lucas, demand an explanation for his betrayal. The thought of seeing him, of matching the real man to the phantom she'd constructed from his letters, made her stomach churn. But she'd come too far to turn back without answers. Clara lit the oil lamp on the bedside table and sat down to write 2 letters. The first was to her sister, Sarah. Arrived safely in Cedar Hollow. Plans have changed. Will write more soon. Do not worry. Your loving sister, Clara. The second letter took longer. She started and stopped a dozen times, crumpling paper that she could ill afford to waste. Finally, she kept it simple. Mr. Wentworth, I have arrived as planned. I am staying at the Sagebrush Inn, room 7. I believe you owe me a conversation. Mrs. C.M. Donnelly. She'd post them in the morning. Tonight she'd allow herself to grieve, not just for Lucas's betrayal, but for the hope she'd carried across half the country like a secret treasure. Tomorrow she'd figure out how to survive. She'd done it before, after all. Survived Thomas's death, survived the bank taking the farm, survived the peculiar loneliness of being a woman alone in a world that had no place for such creatures. The moon rose over Cedar Hollow, painting the dusty streets silver. Somewhere in this town, Lucas was probably sitting down to dinner with his betrothed, spinning tales about cattle prices and spring roundups. Did he spare a thought for the woman he'd promised to meet at the station? Did he wonder if she'd come at all? Clara pulled the thin hotel blanket up to her chin and stared at the water-stained ceiling. Every night for months she'd written to Lucas before bed, sharing the small details of her day, her hopes for their future. Tonight her hands felt empty, without pen and paper, without the ritual that had sustained her through grief, and toward what she'd thought was love. "Then don't sleep without me again," she whispered to the darkness, repeating words Lucas had written, but never meant. The irony cut deep. She was more alone now than she'd ever been in Kansas, in a strange bed in a strange town with nothing but broken promises for company. But she was also alive, still breathing, still capable of facing tomorrow, whatever it might bring. The coyotes howled outside town as Clara May Donnelly finally closed her eyes, 47 love letters tucked back in her satchel and hard wisdom settling into her bones. The West didn't care about your heartbreak. It only cared that you were strong enough to meet the sunrise. And she would be. God help her, she would be. The hired wagon jolted over every rut and stone on the 12-mile journey to the Wentworth Ranch. Clara gripped the wooden seat, her knuckles white beneath her gloves, while old Samuel, the driver, hummed tunelessly around his tobacco chew. She'd posted her letters at dawn, but impatience had won over propriety. If Lucas wouldn't come to her, she'd go to him. "Wentworth Place is just over that rise," Samuel announced, spitting a brown stream into the sagebrush. "Fine spread. Lucas done well for himself since his daddy passed." Clara had memorized every detail Lucas had shared about his ranch, 2,000 acres. 300 head of cattle, a house with real glass windows and a wraparound porch where they'd sit in the evenings. She'd imagined it so many times she could almost smell the leather and wood smoke, almost hear the creak of rocking chairs and the low of cattle in the distance. Reality struck like a slap. The house was there, yes, but smaller than described, its porch sagging at one corner. The outbuildings looked prosperous enough and cattle dotted the grassland. But Clara's eyes were drawn to the woman's undergarments hanging on the wash line, delicate lacy things that no ranch wife would waste money on unless she was very young or very foolish, or very newly engaged. "Wait here," she told Samuel, climbing down before he could assist her. Her traveling dress was dusty from the road, her hair escaping its pins, but she didn't care. She'd come for truth, not to impress. The front door opened before she could knock. Lucas stood there, and for a moment Clara couldn't reconcile the man before her with the phantom who'd written such beautiful letters. He was handsome enough, tall, broad-shouldered, with the sun-weathered look of a working rancher. But his eyes, brown as coffee, shifted away from hers like a guilty child's. "Clara." Her name fell from his lips like something broken. You got my letter, then?" "What letter?" She kept her voice steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "The last one I received invited me to come to Cedar Hollow. So here I am." He had the grace to flush. "I sent another, 2 weeks ago. We must have crossed paths." "How convenient." Lucas stepped onto the porch, closing the door firmly behind him, protecting something or someone inside. "You shouldn't have come here." "No, I suppose I shouldn't have. But then I did many things I shouldn't have. Like believing you, like selling everything I owned for train fare, like thinking—" She stopped, biting back words that would only shame her further. "I didn't know," he said, running a hand through his dark hair. "About your husband. You never said you were widowed. You never asked. You wrote about wanting a strong woman, someone who understood loss and hard work. Did you think I'd learned those lessons in a parlor? It's different." His jaw tightened. "A widow. There's talk, you understand. People wonder things. Was she a good wife? Why didn't she remarry sooner? What kind of woman answers advertisements?" Each question landed like a physical blow. Clara lifted her chin. "The kind who is foolish enough to believe in second chances." "Lucas!" a young voice called from inside. "Who is it?" "No one," he called back, then winced at his own words. "Business," he amended. "I'll just be a minute." Clara laughed short and bitter. "No one? Well, that's honest, at least." "What do you want me to say?" Frustration crept into his voice. "That I'm sorry I am. That I meant those things I wrote I did at the time. But then Emmeline, Miss Bentley, she's young and fresh without all the complications." "Complications." Clara tasted the word. "Is that what we're calling grief now?" "Her father owns the bank that holds my note. The marriage will secure the ranch for generations." He straightened, finding refuge in practical matters. "It's a good match, a smart match." And I was what, a romantic fancy, something to pass the long winter evenings. "You're twisting things." But his protest lacked conviction. "Look, I'll pay for your ticket home. It's the least I can do." Pride stiffened her spine. "Keep your money. I wouldn't take it if I were starving." "Clara, be reasonable." "Reasonable." She stepped closer, close enough to smell his shaving soap, close enough to see the weakness in his eyes. "I was reasonable when I stayed in Kansas for 2 years after Thomas died, trying to save a farm that couldn't be saved. I was reasonable when I answered your advertisement instead of the dozen others because yours seemed the most honest. I was reasonable when I wrote you 47 letters sharing pieces of my soul I'd shown no one else. Don't you dare ask me to be reasonable now." The door opened and a girl appeared, for she was a girl perhaps 18, with cornflower blue eyes and dimples that had probably never known a day's sorrow. She wore a green dress that matched the curtains Clara had described wanting for the kitchen, and her hand moved possessively to Lucas's arm. "Lucas, I think you should introduce us." He stood trapped between them, the woman he'd promised and the girl he'd chosen. "Emmeline, this is Mrs. Donnelly. She had some business with the ranch. She was just leaving." Emmeline's eyes narrowed with the quick intelligence of a pretty girl who knows her power. Business? How unusual. Won't you come in for tea, Mrs. Donnelly? You must be parched after your journey. It was a challenge wrapped in courtesy. Clara met those bright eyes and saw understanding there. This girl knew exactly who she was. Thank you, but no. My business is concluded. Clara turned back to Lucas one last time. You wrote that you wanted a partner to build something lasting in this wild country. I hope you find what you're looking for. She walked back to the wagon with measured steps, though everything in her wanted to run. Behind her, she heard Emmeline's voice, high and sweet. Who was that, really? And Lucas's response carried on the wind, no one important. Samuel helped her into the wagon without comment, though his weathered face showed he'd heard enough to understand. They rode in silence for a mile before he spoke. Begging your pardon, ma'am, but Lucas Wentworth never was worth the powder to blow him up. His daddy was a good man, but Lucas, he spat again. Takes after his mother's side, all talk no spine. Clara watched the ranch disappear behind them, taking with it months of dreams and carefully tended hope. It seems everyone knew that but me. You ain't from here. How could you know besides? Samuel guided the horses around a washout. Sometimes a person's got to find their own way to wisdom. Can't nobody give it to you. She thought about Thomas, how he'd courted her with actions rather than words, fixing her father's roof, bringing her mother preserves when she was ill, standing steady through drought and plenty alike. She'd loved him for his quiet strength, mourned him for his absence, and somehow forgot the lesson he'd taught that love was what you did, not what you said. You planning on heading back east? Samuel asked as Cedar Hollow came into view. Clara considered it. She had enough money for a ticket if she was careful, if she ate little and traveled rough. She could return to Sarah, help with her children grow old as the spinster aunt who'd once tried to find love in the West and failed. I don't know, she admitted. I honestly don't know. The town looked different in the afternoon light, shabbier but somehow more honest. These buildings didn't pretend to be anything but what they were, shelter against the wind, gathering places for people trying to carve life from an unforgiving land. Even the grand houses on the hill were just wood and nails susceptible to fire and time like everything else. Samuel dropped her at the hotel, refusing the coin she offered. You keep that, ma'am. Seems like you might need it more than me. Mrs. Harriet was at the desk when Clara entered, her sharp eyes taking in the dust and defeat Clara wore like a second skin. No luck with Mr. Wentworth, I take it. Clara's surprise must have shown, because the older woman smiled grimly. Honey, in a town this size, everybody knows everybody's business. Soon as Pete Jennings mentioned a lady asking after Lucas, we all figured what was what. You ain't the first to fall for his letters, though you traveled the furthest. There were others. 2 last year, one from Illinois, one from Missouri. Both pretty as pictures, both left within a week. Mrs. Harriet's expression softened. Men like Lucas, they collect women's hearts like some collect stamps. It ain't about you, honey. It's about them. Clara sank into the lobby chair, suddenly exhausted. I sold everything, came all this way. And you're still breathing, aren't you? Still got your health, your sense, your dignity, though that last one might be a bit bruised. Mrs. Harriet came around the desk, settling her ample form into the opposite chair. Let me tell you something. I came west with my husband 20 years ago. He died in a mine collapse year 2. I could have gone back to Ohio, lived with his mother, been proper and pitied. Instead, I stayed. Opened this hotel. Buried 2 more husbands and raised 3 kids who weren't my own. This country's hard, Mrs. Donnelly, but it's fair. It'll give you what you earn, nothing more, nothing less. I don't know if I'm strong enough. Hogwash. You got on that train, didn't you, face that man today? Heard his excuses and didn't beg, and Mrs. Harriet stood, joints creaking. That's strong enough for a start. Rest is just practice. Clara climbed the stairs to her room, each step an effort. She sat on the bed and pulled out Lucas's letters one more time. Read them with new eyes, seeing now what she'd missed, the pretty phrases that promised nothing concrete, the way he'd sidestepped her questions about practical matters, how he'd painted pictures without ever filling in the details. She'd been so lonely, so eager to believe that somewhere a man was writing to her, specifically choosing her out of all the women in the world. But Lucas hadn't been writing to Clara May Donnelly. He'd been writing to an idea, a fantasy of feminine perfection that no real woman could embody, especially not one who'd buried a husband, lost a farm, and learned that survival sometimes meant letting go of softness. One by one, she fed the letters to the lamp flame, watching his lies turn to ash and drift out the window. With each burning page, something in her chest loosened. Grief, yes, but also a strange relief. She'd been carrying those letters like sacred texts, but they were just paper and ink, no more substantial than the promises they contained. The last letter was the first he'd written, responding to her initial inquiry. She hesitated, then read it once more. "Dear Madam, your letter touched something in me I thought long dead." Clara laughed, surprising herself. Perhaps something in Lucas had been dead: his courage, his integrity, his ability to choose hard love over easy comfort. She dropped the final letter into the flame and watched it curl into nothing. Outside her window, Cedar Hollow went about its evening business. She was still here, still alone, still uncertain of tomorrow. But she was also free of false promises, free of a future built on lies, free to choose her own path, even if she didn't yet know where it led. The man who didn't have enough courage had given her something after all the knowledge that she had courage enough for two. The morning after burning Lucas's letters, Clara woke to find her money had dwindled to barely enough for 2 more nights at the Sagebrush Inn. She dressed carefully, pinning her hair with extra care, and went downstairs to find Mrs. Harriet. "I need work," she said without preamble. "I can sew, cook, clean, teach letters and numbers, whatever you have." Mrs. Harriet studied her over steel-rimmed spectacles. "I could use help here, but I can't pay much. Room and board, maybe $1 a week if business is good." Before Clara could accept, the hotel door chimed. A woman entered, small, graying, with sharp, dark eyes and hands that moved constantly, speaking in signs Clara didn't understand. Mrs. Harriet's face lit up. "Minnie, perfect timing." She turned to Clara. "This here's Minnie Walsh. Runs the boarding house on Elm Street. Lost her voice to scarlet fever 20 years back, but don't let that fool you. She hears everything and understands twice as much." Minnie's eyes swept over Clara with the intensity of someone who'd learned to read people like books. She signed rapidly to Mrs. Harriet, who translated. "She's asking if you're the woman who came for Lucas Wentworth." Heat rose in Clara's cheeks, but she nodded. There was no point in pretending otherwise. Minnie signed again, her weathered face sympathetic. Mrs. Harriet smiled. "She says she's got a room available smaller than here but cleaner, $2 a week including meals, but she'll trade part of it for sewing work. Her eyesight ain't what it was." Clara looked between the two women, understanding passing like electricity between them, the unspoken sisterhood of women who'd been disappointed by men and survived it. "I accept. When can I move in?" Minnie held up one finger. "Today." The boarding house stood 2 stories tall, painted white with green shutters that had seen better days. Inside it smelled of beeswax and lavender, every surface clean enough to eat from. Minnie led Clara up narrow stairs to a room at the back, barely larger than a closet, with a single-bed washstand and small window overlooking a vegetable garden. Minnie pointed to the bed, then to Clara, then made a questioning gesture. "It's perfect," Clara said, meaning it. After the hotel's impersonal furnishings, this small space felt like a sanctuary. "Thank you." Minnie smiled, a transformation that took years off her lined face. She gestured for Clara to follow her back downstairs to a room filled with fabric thread and half-finished garments. Through a combination of gestures and objects, she communicated what needed doing, mending for the boarding house linens, alterations for other residents, and finishing work on several dresses. They established a rhythm quickly. Minnie would show Clara what needed doing, and Clara would set to work. When words were necessary, Minnie wrote on a slate she kept handy, her spelling creative but clear enough. Clara found the silence soothing after days of painful conversations. That evening, Clara met the other boarders around Minnie's dining table. There was Jacob Henley, a widowed schoolteacher who'd lost his wife in childbirth, the widow Patterson, who ran the town's small millinery shop, and 2 young men who worked at the lumber mill and ate like they'd never see food again. "So you're the lady who—" one of the mill workers began, but Widow Patterson kicked him under the table. "Who's new to town?" she finished firmly. Welcome, Mrs. Donnelly. I hope you'll find Cedar Hollow to your liking." Clara recognized the kindness in the deflection. "Thank you. I'm still finding my bearings." "Aren't we all?" Jacob said quietly, his own grief recognizable in the hollow of his cheeks. Some bearings are harder to find than others. After dinner, Clara helped clear dishes while Minnie washed. Through the kitchen window, she could see the town settling into evening shopkeepers, closing up cowboys, heading to the saloon families gathering on porches. It was the same dance she'd watched in a dozen towns between Kansas and here, but now she was part of it. However, temporarily. Minnie touched her shoulder, signed something, then wrote on her slate, "You, sad but strong. Good." Such simple words, but they made Clara's eyes burn with unshed tears. "I don't feel strong." Minnie set down her dish rag, took Clara's face between damp, work-worn hands, and looked directly into her eyes. She didn't need words to communicate what she meant. "I see you. I understand. You will survive this." That night, Clara lay in her narrow bed, listening to the house settle around her. Through the thin walls, she could hear Jacob pacing 3 steps to the window, 3 steps back, the restless movement of a man who'd forgotten how to sleep alone. Below, Widow Patterson hummed while she worked on her hats, the melody familiar but nameless. This wasn't what she'd imagined when she'd boarded the train in Kansas. She'd pictured herself mistress of a ranch, learning to be a cattleman's wife, building something lasting with a man who'd chosen her. Instead, she was a boarder in a house of other lost souls, earning her keep with needle and thread. But there was something clean about it, something honest. No false promises here, no pretty words masking ugly truths. Just work and rest meals shared with people who understood that sometimes the best comfort was no questions asked. She thought of Thomas, wondering what he'd make of her situation. He'd been a practical man, not given to fancy words or grand gestures. "Clara May," he'd have said in his steady way, "you've got a roof over your head, food in your belly, and work for your hands. Rest is just details." The memory made her smile in the darkness. Perhaps she'd been looking for another Thomas in Lucas's letters, forgetting that men like her late husband didn't need to advertise in newspapers. They were too busy working building, doing the steady labor of living. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. She opened the door to find Minnie holding a bundle of fabric and a lamp. The older woman entered, spreading the material on Clara's bed, a half-finished quilt in the wedding ring pattern worked in blues and creams. Minnie pointed to a section where the stitching had pulled loose, then demonstrated with careful gestures how to repair it. But Clara understood this was about more than quilting. This was Minnie's way of saying she wasn't alone, that other women had sat in small rooms mending torn dreams along with torn fabric. They worked together in companionable silence, the lamplight creating a golden circle that held back the darkness. Minnie's fingers were swift despite her age, each stitch precise and sure. Clara matched her rhythm, finding peace in the repetitive motion. When the section was repaired, Minnie pointed to Clara, then to the quilt, making a giving motion. "For me," Clara shook her head. "I couldn't. It's too fine." Minnie's face set in stubborn lines. She wrote on her slate, "Wedding gift, never used, better for warmth than memories." Clara touched the soft fabric, tracing the interlocking rings. Another woman's hope stitched with careful hands for a future that never came. What happened? Minnie's hands stilled. She looked toward the window for a long moment, then wrote, "He chose someone younger, prettier, with a voice." The words hung between them, stark in their simplicity. Clara reached for Minnie's hand, squeezing gently. "His loss." Minnie smiled sadly, then wrote, "Yes, but my gain too, free to choose my own life." She gathered her things, leaving the quilt behind. At the door, she turned back and signed something Clara was beginning to recognize, the gesture she used for "good night" with all the boarders. But then she added something new, touching her chest, then pointing to Clara, then back to herself. Clara didn't need a translation. She understood, "You are not alone. We are the same." After Minnie left, Clara spread the quilt over her bed. The wedding ring pattern seemed different in the lamplight. Not broken circles of failed promises, but links in a chain connecting all the women who'd loved and lost and learned to continue. She thought of Mrs. Harriet building a business from grief, of Minnie creating a home for other wanderers after her own dreams shattered, of Widow Patterson downstairs humming over her hats, turning ribbon and felt into beauty. All of them had been where Clara was now, facing a future they hadn't planned in a place they hadn't chosen. Tomorrow, she'd start earning her keep properly mending and sewing for strangers. Tomorrow, she'd walk the streets of Cedar Hollow without looking for Lucas around every corner. Tomorrow, she'd begin building whatever life was possible from the ashes of her plans. But tonight, wrapped in another woman's wedding quilt, surrounded by the quiet breathing of a house full of survivors, Clara Mae Donnelly finally felt something she hadn't expected: the beginning of home. Not the home she'd imagined in Lucas's letters, grand and romantic and built on promises, but something smaller, truer, fashioned from shared sorrow and small kindnesses, held together by stitches as careful as those in the quilt that warmed her. Through her window, a slice of moon hung over Cedar Hollow like a benediction. Somewhere in town, Lucas was probably sleeping beside his young bride, secure in his choices. Clara wished him no ill. He'd have to live with his weakness just as she'd have to live with her strength. The difference was she wouldn't be living it alone. 3 weeks into her life at Minnie's boarding house, Clara ventured to Morrison's general store for thread and needles. The bell above the door announced her arrival to a nearly empty shop, dust motes dancing in the afternoon sun that slanted through unwashed windows. She was examining a card of pearl buttons when it happened: a collision of shoulders, a cascade of falling goods, and strong hands steadying her before she could stumble. "Whoa there, ma'am. My fault entirely." Clara looked up into eyes the color of sage honey set in a face that spoke of long days under an unforgiving sun. The man was tall, broad-shouldered in the way of men who worked with their hands, his dark hair curling slightly where it met his collar. Trail dust covered his worn jacket, and his boots carried the evidence of miles traveled. No harm done, she managed, stepping back to a proper distance. But something in his steady gaze held her a moment longer than propriety allowed. He knelt to gather the scattered items, her thread a tin of crackers he'd been carrying, a small bag of penny nails that rang like rain as they hit the floor. His movements were efficient, unconscious grace, born of a life handling horses and cattle. "Wade Callahan," he said, straightening and offering the rescued thread. "Run the stock station up north of town." "Mrs. Donnelly." She took the thread, noting the calluses on his fingers, the careful way he handled even small things. "Thank you." He touched the brim of his hat, a gesture she'd seen a dozen times from a dozen men, but something in his execution made it feel less like habit and more like recognition. Then his eyes narrowed slightly, taking in details she'd hoped weren't so obvious: the twice-turned cuffs of her dress, the careful mending at her collar, the way she held herself like someone who'd learned to occupy less space. "You're new to Cedar Hollow?" It wasn't a question, but she nodded anyway. "A few weeks." "From back east?" "Kansas." "Long way to travel alone." There was no judgment in his tone, just observation. Clara lifted her chin. "I've found the distance between places matters less than the distance between expectations and reality." Something shifted in his expression, surprise, perhaps, or recognition. That's a truth not many learn easy. The shopkeeper, Morrison, appeared from the back room. "Wade, got your order ready? 20 pounds of coffee, 10 of sugar salt pork beans." "Add whatever Mrs. Donnelly needs to my account," Wade interrupted, then looked at Clara. "Unless that would offend you." She should refuse. She'd learned the cost of accepting favors from men who wrote prettier than they acted. But there was something different here. He wasn't trying to impress or possess. His offer felt like what it was: one traveler recognizing another's weariness. "Just the thread," she said carefully. "But I thank you for the kindness." He studied her a moment longer, and she had the strangest feeling he could see straight through to all the broken places she was trying to mend. Then the wind picked up outside, rattling the windows, and he glanced toward the door. "Storm coming," he said. "Early for the season, but the mountains don't follow calendars. You settled somewhere safe." "Minnie Walsh's boarding house." His face softened at the name. "Good woman, Minnie. Helped patch up more than a few of my boys when they've come to town feeling poorly. She'll see you right." Morrison wrapped her thread in brown paper, and Wade moved to load his supplies. Clara expected him to leave things there a chance encounter, nothing more. But at the door he paused. "Mrs. Donnelly, you wouldn't happen to sew more than just mending?" "I do. My men are rough on their clothes. Trail work doesn't leave much time for repairs. If you're taking in work..." He pulled a worn leather wallet from his jacket. "I'd pay fair wages. $1 a shirt, 2 for coats." It was more than fair. It was generous. Clara calculated quickly. Even a few shirts a week would mean the difference between surviving and saving, between trapped and free. "Bring them by Minnie's," she heard herself say. "I'll see what can be done." He smiled, then just a slight lift at the corner of his mouth. But it transformed his face from merely handsome to something that made her heart skip in a way she'd thought grief had cured her of. "Obliged, ma'am." He settled his hat more firmly as the wind gusted again. "You look like someone who's already walked through plenty of weather, but all the same." He unwound the knitted scarf from his neck, deep blue wool soft with wear, and held it out. "Wind's got teeth today." She should refuse this too. But the wind was cold, and the scarf smelled of leather and campfire smoke, and his eyes held nothing but simple concern. She took it, wrapping it around her shoulders. "I'll return it when you bring the mending. Keep it long as you need." He touched his hat brim again and was gone, loading his supplies onto a sturdy wagon before the first fat raindrops began to fall. Clara hurried back to the boarding house, Wade's scarf warm against the rising wind. Minnie met her at the door, eyebrows raised at the sight of the blue wool. She signed something rapid, a question clearly. "A man at the store," Clara explained, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. "Wade Callahan. He mentioned you know him." Minnie's face went through several expressions in quick succession: surprise, consideration, then something that might have been approval. She wrote on her slate, "Good man, hard life. Wife died birthing, 5 years past." Another widower. Cedar Hollow seemed full of them, as if grief drew people to these hard places where survival took precedence over sorrow. Clara touched the scarf, thinking of the careful way he'd handled her fallen thread, the way he'd offered help without making her feel pitied. That evening, the promised storm arrived in full force. Rain lashed the windows while wind howled around the eaves like something alive and angry. The boarders gathered in the parlor, drawn together by the violence of the weather. Jacob read aloud from Pilgrim's Progress, while Widow Patterson worked on a hat and the mill workers played checkers. Clara sat by the lamp mending a pillowcase, but her mind kept returning to the afternoon's encounter. She'd trained herself not to notice men beyond the practical, who might hire her, who might cause trouble, who could be trusted. But Wade Callahan had slipped past her defenses with his quiet competence and unexpected understanding. "You seem distracted," Jacob observed during a pause in his reading. "Not an admirer of Bunyan." "My apologies. The storm has me woolly-headed." "That's a nice scarf," Widow Patterson said too casually. "Don't recall seeing it before." Clara's hand moved unconsciously to the blue wool. "It was lent to me, against the weather." "Wade Callahan's been wearing a scarf that color for years," one of the mill workers piped up. "Saw him at Morrison's today without it." All eyes turned to Clara. She kept her stitches steady, though her face burned. "He was kind enough to loan it when the wind picked up. He's bringing mending work by later in the week." "Wade Callahan's bringing his own mending." Widow Patterson's needle stilled. "Well, that's something. Man hasn't looked twice at a woman since Mary passed." "It's business," Clara said firmly. "Nothing more." Minnie made a sound that might have been laughter if she'd had a voice for it. She caught Clara's eye and signed something that needed no translation, a deeply skeptical expression that said louder than words, "We'll see about that." The storm raged on, but inside the boarding house, warmth and lamplight held it at bay. Clara bent over her sewing, trying not to think about sage honey eyes and work-worn hands, about the way a simple scarf could feel like armor against more than just the wind. She'd come to Cedar Hollow following pretty words and empty promises. She'd learned her lesson about trusting too quickly, hoping too much. But as thunder rolled over the town and rain drummed against the roof, she couldn't quite stop herself from wondering what Wade Callahan looked like when he smiled fully, or what his voice might sound like speaking her given name. Dangerous thoughts for a woman who'd already paid the price of romantic foolishness. But then again, Clara reflected as she tied off her thread. Perhaps the danger wasn't in the thoughts themselves, but in mistaking words for deeds, promises for truth. Wade hadn't promised anything except fair wages for honest work. He'd offered a scarf against the cold, nothing more. If she could keep it that simple, that clear, perhaps she could navigate this without adding new scars to her collection. Through the rain-lashed window, lightning illuminated the town for a brilliant instant. Somewhere out there, Wade was probably tending to his stock station, making sure his men and animals were safe from the storm. A man who noticed coming weather and thought to warn a stranger that was something real, something solid. More solid than 47 love letters had ever been. Clara folded the mended pillowcase and reached for the next piece, her fingers steady despite the storm. The blue scarf lay warm around her shoulders, carrying the scent of trail dust and honest work. Not a promise, she reminded herself, just wool against the wind. But as she worked through the evening, she couldn't help but feel that sometimes the simplest gestures thread gathered from a flora scarf freely given might speak truths that all the pretty letters in the world could never capture. The storm would pass, the sun would rise, and later this week, Wade Callahan would bring his mending and she would return his scarf and life would continue in its practical way. But tonight, wrapped in borrowed warmth, while the storm tried to tear the world apart outside, Clara May Donnelly allowed herself just a moment to wonder if perhaps Cedar Hollow had more to offer than mere survival. Just a moment. Then she bent back to her sewing, stitching together more than just fabric in the lamplight of a house that was beginning to feel like home. The back room of Minnie's boarding house transformed under Clara's careful hands. What had once been storage for forgotten trunks and broken furniture became a proper sewing room with good light from the north window and shelves fashioned from old crates. Minnie helped her move a sturdy table from the cellar, and within days, Clara had created a workspace that smelled of fresh cotton and possibilities. True to his word, Wade appeared 3 days after the storm with a bundle of damaged clothing that spoke eloquently of hard living. Torn shirts, coats with ripped seams, trousers worn through at the knees, each garment carrying the evidence of men who worked from dawn to dusk, with horses, cattle, and unforgiving terrain. "Afraid we're rough on things," he said, setting the bundle on her work table. His eyes took in the organized space, the neat rows of thread, her mending basket already half full with other work. "This is fine, right professional." "Thank you." Clara unwrapped the clothes, assessing damage with practiced eyes. "Most of this is salvageable. This shirt might be beyond help, though." She held up a garment more whole than fabric. "That's Pete's. Boy could tear steel if you gave him half a chance." Wade's mouth quirked in that almost smile she remembered. "Do what you can. If it's past saving, we'll use it for rags." She sorted the clothes by type of repair needed, mentally calculating time and materials. Wade watched her work, and she became acutely aware of his presence, the way he filled the small room, how his clothes carried the scent of leather and pine smoke. "Your scarf," she said suddenly, reaching for where she'd folded it carefully on a shelf. "Thank you for the loan." "Keep it." When she started to protest, he added, "Winter's coming on. You'll need it more than I will." "I couldn't." "Consider it partial payment, then, for taking on this mess." He gestured at the pile of mending. "Unless that would offend you." There it was again, that careful consideration, the way he offered without imposing. Clara fingered the soft wool, then nodded. "Then I thank you." He gathered his hat from where he'd set it on a crate. "I'll be back in a week for whatever's ready." "That suit." "Yes." She walked him to the door, professional despite the flutter in her chest. "Mr. Callahan." "Wade," he corrected gently. "Mr. Callahan was my father, and he's been gone these 15 years. Wade. His name felt foreign on her tongue, too intimate for their brief acquaintance. "How did you know about Minnie, I mean? That she can't speak?" He paused in the doorway, considering. "First time I came to town after Mary died, I was in a bad way. Drunk, if I'm honest. Started a fight at the saloon, ended up bleeding on Minnie's front steps. She could have turned me away, most would have. Instead, she dragged me inside, cleaned me up, let me sleep it off in her parlor. His eyes grew distant with memory. Never said a word, of course. Didn't need to. Just kept pouring coffee and giving me looks that said clearer than speech what a fool I was being. She has a gift for that, Clara agreed, thinking of all the silent conversations she'd had with their landlady. That she does. He settled his hat, touching the brim in what was becoming a familiar gesture. Week from today, then. After he left, Clara stood in her makeshift workshop, holding his blue scarf and trying to understand the warmth spreading through her chest. She'd been so careful since arriving in Cedar Hollow, keeping her heart locked away like valuables in a bank vault. But Wade Callahan seemed to slip past her defenses without even trying with his quiet ways and careful kindness. She hung the scarf on a peg and got to work, starting with the simplest repairs. As her needle flew through fabric, she found herself thinking of Mary Callahan, who died bringing life into the world. Another ghost in a town full of them. Did Wade still wake, reaching for her? Did he see her in the faces of other women the way Clara sometimes caught glimpses of Thomas in a stranger's gesture or laugh? The work settled her as it always did. Stitch by stitch, she mended tears and reinforced seams, bringing order from chaos. By afternoon, she'd finished 3 shirts and started on a coat with a ripped lining. Word spread as word always did in small towns. By the next day, Clara had requests from other ranchers' cowboys, passing through even the banker's wife, who needed delicate work on a silk dress. She began keeping careful accounts in a ledger Minnie provided, tracking income and expenses with the same attention she gave her stitches. Wade's men started stopping by, individually bashful and polite, picking up their mended clothes and leaving new work. They were a rough lot, sun-weathered and trail-worn, but respectful, always removing their hats and calling her ma'am, in voices unused to indoor speaking. Pete, the one whose shirt had been beyond saving, turned red as a sunset when she handed him his mended trousers. "Obliged, ma'am. These'll last another season now, certain sure." "You're welcome. Try to avoid barbed wire if you can." He grinned young beneath the trail dust. "Yes, ma'am, though the wire don't always cooperate." She learned their names, Pete Samuel, Old Ben Charlie Duke, and something of their stories. Men who'd drifted west for a dozen reasons, finding work and purpose at Wade Station. They spoke of their boss with clear respect, painting a picture of a fair man who worked alongside them, who knew horses and weather and the hard arithmetic of survival. One evening, as Clara worked late finishing a particularly complex repair, Minnie appeared with tea and a questioning look. "It's good work," Clara said, understanding the unspoken query. "Honest work. I'm grateful for it." Minnie wrote on her slate, "Not what I asked." Clara set down her needle-flexing tired fingers. "What are you asking, then?" "Him, you, possibility." "No." The word came too quick, too sharp. Clara softened it with explanation. "I came here following empty promises. I won't make that mistake again." Minnie studied her for a long moment, then wrote, "Not all men write pretty lies. Some speak plain truth." "And some say nothing at all," Clara countered, thinking of Thomas, who'd loved her steadily without need for words. Minnie nodded slowly, then added, "Wade buried his words with Mary, but he's not dead. Neither are you." She left before Clara could respond, taking the tea tray but leaving her words hanging in the air like thread, waiting to be woven into something new. Days passed in rhythm, sewing, mending, building her small business stitch by careful stitch. The banker's wife told her friends who told their friends, and soon Clara had more work than hours in the day. She hired Widow Patterson to help with simple repairs, and the 2 women worked companionably in the afternoon light. "You're building something here," the widow observed, finishing a hem. "Roots like—" "Just trying to earn my keep," Clara deflected. But she knew it was more than that. Each repaired garment, each satisfied customer, each coin in her savings jar. They were all threads in a new life she was weaving from the scraps of the old. When Wade returned, as promised, Clara had his men's clothes ready, cleaned and pressed, as well as mended. He counted out payment without haggling, then surprised her by adding an extra $1. "For the rush work," he explained when she protested. "Pete needed those trousers for a dance Saturday night. Boy's sweet on the schoolteacher's daughter." "Is he now?" Clara smiled, picturing the young cowboy's blushes. I hope she appreciates a man who takes care with his appearance. Sally Morrison's a sensible girl. She'll see past the trail dust to what matters. Wade pocketed his receipt, then hesitated. Speaking of the dance, Clara's heart stuttered, but he continued in his measured way. So, the ladies are organizing refreshments. Minnie usually helps, but with her hands getting stiff, she could use assistance, if you were inclined. Not an invitation to dance, not a courtship, just another practical arrangement, one neighbor helping another. Clara told herself the disappointment she felt was relief in disguise. I'd be happy to help. Good. He gathered the bundle of clothes, then paused at the door. You know, when I first came to Cedar Hollow, I spent 6 months waiting for the ground to feel solid under my feet again. Kept expecting to wake up and find myself back in Missouri, Mary still alive, everything the way it was. Clara's hand stilled on the fabric she'd been folding. When did it change? Day I realized I'd stopped looking backward every time I took a step forward. His eyes met hers, sage honey warm with understanding. Doesn't mean forgetting. Just means remembering doesn't have to hurt quite so much. After he left, Clara sat in her quiet workshop, surrounded by the tools of her trade and the evidence of her growing independence. Through the window, she could see the town going about its business. Morrison sweeping his store steps, children playing in the dusty street life, moving forward with or without her participation. She picked up Wade's scarf from its peg, running her fingers over the soft wool. Not a promise, she reminded herself. Not a declaration. Just threads woven together for warmth, like the new life she was building one stitch at a time. But as she wrapped it around her shoulders and bent back to her work, Clara couldn't help but think that sometimes the most lasting things began not with grand gestures or pretty words, but with simple acts of kindness thread gathered from a floor, a scarf given against the cold work offered and fairly paid. In her ledger, she carefully recorded the week's earnings. The numbers were small, but growing each entry a step towards something she couldn't quite name yet. Security, perhaps. Independence, certainly. Or maybe whispered a voice that sounded suspiciously like Minnie's knowing silence, the possibility of something more. The whispers started small, like seeds scattered on fertile ground. Clara first noticed them at Morrison's store conversations that stopped when she entered, eyes that followed her movements with speculation rather than simple curiosity. She'd lived through gossip before in Kansas after Thomas died, when neighbors wondered what a young widow would do with her grief and her empty bed. Don't let it trouble you, Widow Patterson advised as they worked together on a batch of curtains for the hotel. Small towns need their entertainment. Next week they'll find someone else to talk about. But the whispers grew louder when Wade began stopping by twice a week instead of once, sometimes with mending, sometimes just to check if she needed supplies from Morrison's. Their conversations remained properly brief, conducted in the doorway of her workshop. But in Cedar Hollow, even propriety could be twisted into scandal. The breaking point came on a crisp October morning. Clara was returning from the post office, having mailed her monthly letter to Sarah, when she heard her name carried on the wind from 2 women talking outside the millinery shop. Living in sin, mark my words. That Callahan man comes and goes like he owns the place. Well, what do you expect from a woman who'd answer a marriage advertisement no proper lady would? Clara's steps slowed, though everything in her wanted to run. She recognized the voices, Mrs. Bentley Lucas's new mother-in-law, and Mrs. Fletcher, the minister's wife. Pillars of Cedar Hollow society, their words carrying weight like stones. I buried one husband already. Some say he didn't die natural, that she... Ladies. Clara stepped around the corner, her voice steady despite the rage burning in her chest. If you're going to discuss my character, perhaps you'd care to do it to my face. Mrs. Bentley had the grace to flush, but Mrs. Fletcher lifted her chin defiantly. Mrs. Donnelly, we were simply expressing concern about the impropriety of your situation. My situation? Clara kept her tone level, though her hands clenched in her skirts. You mean my work as a seamstress, my residence in a respectable boarding house, or perhaps my grievous sin of accepting mending work from local ranchers? Your relationship with Mr. Callahan has become a subject of discussion, Mrs. Bentley said, recovering her composure. Surely you understand how it appears a widow woman entertaining a man. I entertain no one. I conduct business in my workshop during daylight hours with the door open. If that constitutes scandal in Cedar Hollow, then your town has precious little to occupy its minds." Mrs. Fletcher's mouth pursed like she'd bitten into spoiled fruit. "There's no need to take that tone. We're simply concerned about maintaining proper moral standards." "As concerned as you were when Lucas Wentworth was writing to multiple women while courting your daughter, Mrs. Bentley." Clara watched the older woman's face drain of color. "Oh yes, I know about the others. The woman from Illinois, the one from Missouri. Did you counsel him on moral standards then, or did his bank account excuse his behavior?" "How dare you?" "I dare because I'm tired of hypocrites deciding who deserves respect and who doesn't." Clara stepped closer, noting with satisfaction how both women retreated slightly. "I came to this town with honest intentions and was deceived. I stayed and built an honest business with my own hands. If that threatens you more than a man who trades in false promises, then perhaps you should examine your own moral standards." She turned to leave, then paused. "One more thing. My husband died of pneumonia tended by Dr. Morrison of Topeka, who can verify every detail if you're so inclined to investigate. Spread your gossip if you must, but spread lies about Thomas's death and I'll see you in court for slander." Clara walked away with measured steps, leaving silence in her wake. But her hands shook as she climbed the stairs to Minnie's boarding house, and she barely made it to her room before the tears came, not of sadness, but of fury. A soft knock interrupted her storm. Minnie entered without waiting for permission, took one look at Clara's face, and gathered her into a fierce embrace. They stayed that way for long minutes, Clara sobbing out her anger while Minnie held her steady, speaking comfort without words. When the tears finally stopped, Minnie produced her slate. "Heard already?" Mrs. Fletcher stormed past looking like thunder. "I shouldn't have said those things. It'll only make matters worse." Minnie shook her head firmly and wrote, "Truth needed saying. Those harpies been picking at folks for years." Despite everything, Clara almost smiled. "Harpies, Minnie Walsh, you surprise me." The older woman's eyes twinkled as she wrote, "Could use stronger words, but you're a lady." They were interrupted by heavy footsteps on the stairs. Wade appeared in the doorway, his face dark with barely controlled anger. "Clara, Mrs. Clara, I just heard—" He stopped, taking in her tear-stained face, Minnie's protective posture. "Forgive me, I shouldn't have, I'll go." "No." Clara stood smoothing her skirts. "Please come in, though I warn you being seen here will only fuel more gossip." "Let them talk." He removed his hat, turning it in his hands. "I came to apologize. This is my fault. I should have realized how my visits would be perceived." "Your visits are business. Nothing improper has occurred." "No, but—" He struggled for words, this man more comfortable with actions than speeches. "I've brought trouble to your door. That wasn't my intention." Minnie looked between them, then wrote on her slate and showed it to Wade. "Stop dancing, both of you. Truth needs air." She left them alone, closing the door firmly behind her. Clara stood by the window, acutely aware of Wade's presence in her small room, the impropriety of it despite her brave words to the gossips. "I should go," Wade said again, but didn't move. "Is that what you want?" Clara turned to face him. "To go to stop bringing your mending, to cross the street when you see me to avoid causing talk?" "No." The word came sharp and quick. "But what I want and what's right?" "What's right?" Clara laughed bitterly. "According to who Mrs. Fletcher, who forgives her husband's drinking because he preaches temperance on Sundays, Mrs. Bentley, who bought her daughter's marriage to secure her social position?" Wade set his hat aside, running a hand through his hair. "You don't understand. My reputation's already made. I'm the widower who lives with rough men and cattle who comes to town only when necessary. But you're trying to build something here. I won't be the reason you fail." "You give yourself too much credit." Clara moved closer, drawn by the pain in his voice. "I'm not some fragile flower who needs protection. I'm a woman who's buried a husband, lost a farm, survived betrayal, and built a business from nothing. If gossips want to destroy me, they'll need more than whispered speculation about your visits." He looked at her, then really looked, and she saw something shift in his expression. "You faced them down, didn't you, Mrs. Fletcher and Mrs. Bentley?" "I may have mentioned certain uncomfortable truths." A smile ghosted across his lips. I'd have given a month's wages to see that. It wasn't my finest moment. No. He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the leather and sunshine that clung to him. Sounds to me like you showed them your backbone. That's never a bad thing. They stood there separated by propriety but connected by something stronger shared loss, perhaps, or the understanding that came from surviving when survival wasn't guaranteed. Wade, Clara said softly, why do you really come? It's not just for mending. Your men could bring their own clothes. He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, first time was curiosity, I'll admit. Wanted to see the woman who'd traveled so far on promises. Second time was because you did good work, fair prices. After that, he met her eyes. After that, it was because talking to you was the first time since Mary died that I didn't feel like I was drowning. Clara's breath caught. Wade! I'm not asking for anything, he continued quickly. Not making promises I might not keep. Just telling you the truth, since that seems to be the theme today. The truth, Clara repeated. Then here's mine. I look forward to your visits. I tell myself it's for the business, the steady income, but that's only part of it. You make me feel, she paused, searching for words, like I'm more than just my grief, like there might be something beyond mere survival. There is, his voice was certain. I've seen it. Took me 5 years to find it, but it's there. A knock interrupted whatever might have come next. Jacob's voice carried through the door. Mrs. Donnelly. There's a customer downstairs. Says it's urgent. Clara and Wade stepped apart, the spell broken. He gathered his hat while she checked her appearance in the small mirror, trying to erase evidence of tears and revelations. I'll go out the back, Wade said. No need to add fuel to the fire. No. Clara lifted her chin. You'll go out the front door like any other customer. I won't skulk in shadows because gossips have nothing better to do than invent scandals. His smile was fuller this time, warming his eyes. That's the spirit that'll serve you well out here. Don't let anyone tell you different. They descended the stairs together, finding Lucas Wentworth pacing in Minnie's parlor. He looked up at their entrance, his face cycling through surprised discomfort and something that might have been jealousy. Clara, Mr. Callahan. He clutched a bundle of what looked like letters. I need to speak with you, privately. Whatever you have to say can be said here, Clara replied, noting Minnie hovering in the kitchen doorway and Jacob pretending to read in the corner. Lucas glanced at Wade, who stood solid as a mountain at Clara's shoulder. Very well. I've come to ask for those letters back. The ones I wrote you. Emmeline is distressed by their existence. Clara almost laughed. The letters I burned weeks ago. Those letters. His face fell. You burned them? Every last one. Though I'm curious why your wife would be distressed by correspondence you claimed meant nothing. Lucas flushed, and suddenly Clara saw him clearly, not the romantic figure she'd imagined, but a weak man caught between his choices trying to erase evidence of his fickleness. I see. He straightened his coat. Then I apologize for disturbing you. Good day. He left quickly, almost running into Mrs. Fletcher, who was clearly coming to continue the morning's confrontation. The minister's wife took one look at the assembled group, Clara and Wade standing together. Minnie glaring from the kitchen, Jacob rising with protective instincts, and retreated. Well, Wade said into the silence that followed. That was interesting. Clara laughed, surprising herself with the sound. Is every day this dramatic in Cedar Hollow? Only since you arrived, Jacob said with a rare smile. Town was downright boring before. Minnie emerged from the kitchen, writing furiously. Good riddance to both. Now Mr. Callahan staying for coffee? Wade glanced at Clara, a question in his eyes. She nodded, decision made. Coffee sounds fine, he said, if it's no trouble. As Minnie bustled away, and Jacob returned to his book, Wade touched Clara's elbow gently. You sure about this coffee in the parlor's as good as a declaration in a town this size? Then let them talk, Clara said, echoing his earlier words. I'm tired of living according to their whispers. From now on, I'll live according to my own truth. And what's that truth? She looked up at him, this steady man who'd appeared in her life like an unexpected gift. That I'm not just surviving anymore. I'm living, and anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me directly. Wade's smile was answer enough. They went into the parlor together, ready for coffee and whatever consequences came with it. Let Cedar Hollow whisper. Clara Mae Donnelly had found her voice, and she intended to use it. The storm arrived without warning on a November night, announcing itself with thunder that shook the boarding house to its foundations. Clara woke to the sound of wind howling like a living thing, rain hammering against her window with violent intent. Lightning illuminated her small room in stark flashes, revealing her sewing materials scattered by the draft that snuck through the window frame. She rose, wrapping Minnie's wedding quilt around her shoulders, and tried to secure the rattling window. The wind fought her driving rain through every gap, soaking her nightgown sleeves. Down the hall, she heard other boarders' stirring voices raised in concern as the storm's fury increased. A tremendous crack of thunder coincided with pounding on the front door. Clara heard Minnie's shuffling steps, then Jacob's voice raised in alarm. "Good Lord, man, you're soaked through!" Clara grabbed her wrapper and hurried downstairs, finding Wade in the entrance hall, water streaming from his coat, his face grave in the lamplight. His clothes were torn mud-caked, and she saw blood on his sleeve. "Storm took out the bridge at Miller's Creek," he said without preamble, his voice rough with exhaustion. "Stock stations half collapsed. Lost one of the boys. Jimmy got swept into the creek trying to save the horses." "Jimmy?" Clara's hand went to her throat. She knew the boy, barely 18, always whistling, had brought her a torn vest just last week. "We pulled him out downstream. He's alive, but in a bad way. Doc's with him now." Wade swayed slightly, and Clara moved without thinking, steadying him with a hand on his arm. "I need to get back, but the roads are washing out. Wanted to warn folks in town, this storm's not done yet." "You're not going anywhere in this state," Clara said firmly. "Minnie, we need hot water bandages. Jacob helped me get him to the parlor." Wade tried to protest, but exhaustion and Clara's determination won. They got him settled by the fire, and Clara sent Jacob to wake Widow Patterson. She'd need help if Wade's injuries were serious. Minnie brought supplies, her face creased with worry. By lamplight, Clara cut away Wade's torn sleeve, revealing a gash that ran from elbow to wrist. Not deep enough to threaten his life, but ugly and needing attention. She worked in silence, cleaning the wound, while rain lashed the windows and wind tried to tear the roof away. "You've done this before," Wade observed, watching her sure hands. "Thomas worked the farm. Injuries were common." She didn't look up, concentrating on her work. "Hold still. This will hurt." She poured whiskey over the wound, Minnie's medicinal supply, and Wade hissed through his teeth but didn't pull away. His other hand gripped the chair arm knuckles white, but he stayed steady as she began stitching. "Tell me about the station," Clara said, partly to distract him, partly because she needed to hear his voice over the storm's rage. "How bad is the damage?" "Bad enough. Lost the north wall of the barn, most of our winter feed's ruined. The boys got the horses to high ground, but..." His voice caught. "Jimmy was trying to save Dancer, that paint mare I've had since Mary." He stopped, jaw tight. Clara continued her stitching, understanding the weight of unfinished sentences. Some losses couldn't be measured in walls and feed. "He's young," she said softly. "Young men heal quick." "He's the age I was when I married Mary." Wade stared at the fire, seeing something beyond the flames. "Thought I knew everything then. Thought love and hard work could overcome anything." Clara tied off the last stitch, began wrapping the bandage. "You were right about the hard work, at least." "Was I?" He turned to look at her, then his eyes hollow with more than physical exhaustion. "I worked sunrise to sunset, built that station from nothing, and one storm tears it down. Jimmy might lose his leg because I sent him after horses. What's the point of any of it?" The raw pain in his voice made Clara's hands still. She'd heard that note before, in her own voice, after Thomas died, after the bank took the farm, after Lucas's betrayal. The sound of someone questioning whether survival was worth the cost. "The point," she said carefully, "is that tomorrow the sun will rise and you'll rebuild. The point is that you pulled Jimmy from the creek instead of letting him drown. The point is that you came here injured and exhausted to warn people about the roads." "That's not..." The point, she continued, meeting his eyes steadily, is that you're still here, still fighting, still caring enough to grieve what's lost. She finished the bandage but kept her hand on his arm. I spent months after Thomas died asking the same question. What was the point of loving him if I was just going to lose him? What was the point of the farm if the bank would take it? What was the point of coming west if I'd only find more heartbreak? What answer did you find? Clara smiled sadly. That asking the question means you're still alive enough to hurt. And if you can hurt, you can heal. And if you can heal, you can hope. Wade covered her hand with his uninjured one, his palm rough and warm. When did you get so wise? Tuesday, she said, attempting lightness. Wisdom was on sale at Morrison's, right next to the thread. He almost smiled. She could see it fighting through his exhaustion and pain. But then thunder crashed again, rattling the windows, and he struggled to rise. I need to get back. You need to rest. Clara pressed him back into the chair. You're no good to anyone if you collapse on the road. The storm will pass and we'll face whatever comes with daylight. Clara? It was the first time he'd used her given name, and it stopped them both. In the firelight, with the storm raging beyond the walls, something shifted between them, a recognition perhaps, or an admission. I miss her every night, Wade said suddenly, the words tumbling out like water through a broken dam. 5 years and I still reach for her in the dark. Still expect to see her at the stove in the morning, still hear her laughing at something foolish the boys did. Clara sank into the chair across from him, her throat tight. I know. Do you? His eyes searched hers. Do you know what it's like to feel guilty for breathing when they can't? For wanting? He stopped, looked away. For wanting things you have no right to want. Yes, the word came out fierce, surprising them both. Yes, I know exactly what that's like. I know what it's like to hate yourself for laughing at something when they'll never laugh again. For noticing that the world kept spinning after theirs stopped. For feeling your heart beat with something other than grief. They sat in silence while the storm raged, two people who understood that survival could feel like betrayal, that moving forward could feel like leaving love behind. The boys think I'm made of stone, Wade said finally. That nothing touches me. But the truth is I feel everything. I just learned to hide it better. From everyone. He looked at her, then really looked, and Clara felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with her wrapper and unbound hair. Not from you. Somehow, not from you. A log shifted in the fire, sending up sparks. Outside, the wind seemed to ease slightly, though rain still hammered the roof. Clara became aware of how this would look, the two of them alone in the parlor in the deep of night, her in nightclothes, him vulnerable with exhaustion and revelation. You should rest, she said softly. Take my room. I'll sit with Minnie. No. He caught her hand as she rose. Please, just sit with me a while. I'm tired of being alone in storms. Clara knew she should refuse. Knew that if anyone saw them, the gossips would have enough ammunition to destroy what remained of her reputation. But looking at Wade's face, strong features made vulnerable by loss and weariness, she couldn't bring herself to care what Cedar Hollow would say. All right, she said, settling back into her chair. But you need to rest. Close your eyes. I'll keep watch. He smiled. Then, a real smile that transformed his face. Keeping watch. That's what you do, isn't it? Watch over all of us lost souls who wash up at Minnie's door. Someone has to. No, he said seriously. They don't. But you do anyway. That means something, Clara May. He closed his eyes, still holding her hand, and gradually his breathing deepened. Clara sat in the firelight listening to the storm and watching this man who'd crashed into her carefully reconstructed life. She thought about Jimmy fighting the flooded creek, about walls falling and dreams washing away, about the courage it took to rebuild when rebuilding seemed pointless. Wade's hand relaxed in sleep but didn't release hers. In the dying firelight, she could see the lines that grief and weather had carved into his face, could see too the strength that kept him standing when standing seemed impossible. I miss you every night, she whispered to the memory of Thomas, to the ghost of the life she'd planned. But I'm still here, still breathing, still able to feel something beyond the missing. The storm began to ease as dawn approached, wind dying to whispers, rain gentling to steady patter. Clara dozed in her chair. her hand still caught in Wade's, and dreamed of bridges washed away and new ones waiting to be built. When Minnie found them there at first light, Wade sleeping in the chair, Clara watching over him with soft eyes, the older woman simply smiled and closed the door quietly. Some things didn't need words, and some storms cleared the air for whatever weather came next. "Don't sleep without me again," Clara murmured, remembering Lucas's pretty lies. But looking at Wade's face peaceful in exhausted sleep, she thought perhaps the real promise was simpler. Don't weather storms alone when someone's willing to sit with you through the night. The sun broke through the clouds as she finally closed her eyes, painting the parlor in shades of gold and possibility. The morning after the storm, Wade left early to assess the damage at his station, but not before pressing a letter into Clara's hands. "If something happens," he said quietly, "see that my sister in Missouri gets this." Clara wanted to protest the fatalism in his voice, but she understood. The frontier didn't guarantee tomorrow to anyone. She tucked the letter into her sewing basket and watched him ride away on a borrowed horse, his injured arm held carefully against his chest. The town buzzed with storm damage reports. 3 barns down Morrison's store flooded the schoolhouse, missing half its roof. Clara threw herself into helping where she could, mending torn clothes for families who'd lost belongings, helping Minnie prepare food for those whose kitchens were underwater. It was 3 days before she saw Wade again. She was hanging freshly washed fabric to dry when she heard familiar footsteps. Looking up, she found him in the doorway of her workshop, his face haggard but smiling. "Jimmy's going to keep his leg," he said without preamble. "Doc says it's a miracle, but he'll walk again." Relief flooded through her so suddenly she had to grip the clothesline. "Thank God! How are the repairs coming?" "Slow but steady. Lost more than I thought most of the winter feed, some tools tack. But the boys rallied, even got some help from neighboring ranches." He shifted, and she noticed he was carrying a package. "Brought you something. Call it partial payment for the doctoring." Clara dried her hands on her apron. "You already paid me for the mending." "Not for mending." He held out the package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. "For keeping watch. For reminding me why rebuilding matters." Inside was fabric, not the practical cotton and wool she usually worked with, but silk the color of sage honey, soft as whispers. Real dress goods, the kind she hadn't owned since before Thomas died. "Wade, I can't." "You can." His voice was firm. "Woman like you should have at least one dress that's not made from others' leftovers." Besides, a ghost of his usual almost smile appeared. "It's partly selfish. Town's having a Christmas dance to raise money for storm repairs. Thought maybe you'd consider going. With me." Clara's hands stilled on the silk. In the weeks since the storm, since that night of shared grief and clasped hands, they'd been careful. He came for his mending, stayed for coffee, helped repair Minnie's damaged fence. But always in daylight, always with others present. This was different. "People will talk," she said softly. "Let them." He stepped closer, and she could smell leather and sawdust, the honest scent of hard work. "I'm tired of living my life worried about whispers. Aren't you?" Before she could answer, commotion erupted in the street. Through the window, Clara saw a crowd gathering, heard excited voices. Wade frowned and moved to look out. "Stage is in," he said. "But something's wrong. They're carrying—" His face went white. "That's Ben, old Ben from the station." They rushed outside, Clara still clutching the silk. A crowd had formed around the stage where passengers were helping lift down a man Clara recognized as one of Wade's cowboys. His face was bloody, his arm bent at an unnatural angle. "Wade." Ben's voice was weak but urgent. "Thank God. It's Reynolds, that new rancher north of us. He's claiming water rights to Miller's Creek, says the storm changed the boundaries. Shot at Pete when he tried to explain. Says he'll shoot anyone from your outfit who comes near." Wade's expression went dark as granite. "Where's Pete?" "Holed up at the line shack. Reynolds has men watching. Boss, he's serious. Says the storm was God's way of giving him what should have been his all along." Clara had heard of such disputes. Water rights were life and death in cattle country, and men had killed for less. She watched Wade process this information, saw the moment he made his decision. "Get Ben to the dock. he ordered. "Charlie, round up whoever's in town. We ride within the hour." "Wade." Clara caught his sleeve. "You're not thinking of confronting him? Not with your arm still healing." He looked down at her hand on his arm, then up to her face. "That creek waters my herd and 3 others downstream. Without it, we're finished by spring." "Then let the law handle it." "What law?" His laugh was bitter. "Sheriff's in Denver till month's end. By then Reynolds will have fortified his position, maybe hurt more of my boys." He covered her hand with his. "This is the life out here, Clara. Sometimes you have to stand for what's yours or lose it all." She wanted to argue, to point out that violence only bred more violence, that there had to be another way. But looking into his eyes, she saw the truth. This was survival, raw and immediate. This was the West she'd chosen when she stepped off that train. "Then be careful," she said finally, "and come back." Something shifted in his expression. "Would it matter if I didn't?" The crowd around them faded away. Clara was aware only of his eyes on hers, of the question that held more weight than its words. "Yes," she said simply, "it would matter." He lifted her hand from his sleeve, held it for a moment, then pressed something into her palm, a small key on a leather cord. "My strongbox is under the floorboards in the station office. Papers for the ranch, some money, if something happens." "Stop!" Clara closed her fingers around the key, its metal warm from his pocket. "Just come back." He nodded once, then turned to where his men were gathering. Clara watched him check weapons, issue quiet orders, transform from the gentle man who brought her mending into something harder, more dangerous. This, too, was Wade Callahan, the man who'd built a cattle station from nothing, who'd survived loss and storms, and would survive this too. Or so she prayed. The women of Cedar Hollow gathered at the church as the men rode out, some to pray, others to gossip. Clara found herself between Widow Patterson and Minnie, the 3 of them united in their worry. "Reynolds is a hard man," Widow Patterson said quietly. "Came from Texas with money and meanness in equal measure. He's been eyeing Wade's water rights since he arrived." Minnie wrote on her slate, "Wade's tougher and smarter." "Smart doesn't stop bullets," Clara murmured, fingering the key at her throat where she'd hung it on her mother's old chain. Hours passed like years. Clara tried to work, but found herself starting at every sound. Finally, as the sun began to sink toward the mountains, she gave up pretense and joined the other women keeping vigil on the boarding house porch. It was full dark when they heard horses. Clara was on her feet before the riders came into view, counting shadows, searching for one familiar form. There, Wade still in his saddle, Pete riding double with Charlie. No shots fired then? No new graves to dig. The men dismounted in front of the sheriff's office. Clara saw Wade speaking quietly with the others, saw him glance toward the boarding house. Their eyes met across the distance, and he touched his hat brim. Their familiar gesture made precious by the day's dangers. She was in her workshop when he finally came, moving stiffly like a man who'd spent too long in the saddle. "We reached an agreement," he said without preamble. "Reynolds keeps the section the creek cut through in the storm, but the main water rights stay as they were. Nobody died. That's what matters." "You're hurt." Clara could see the way he favored his left side, the dust and blood on his shirt. "Reynolds had opinions about the agreement. We discussed them. I won." He sank into the chair she kept for customers, suddenly looking every one of his 35 years. "Ben's going to be all right." Doc set his arm, "and Pete's got a story to tell at the dance about facing down 3 men with nothing but a branding iron." "And you?" Clara moved closer, seeing now the bruise darkening on his jaw, the torn knuckles. "What story will you tell?" "That I had something worth coming back to." He looked up at her exhaustion, stripping away his usual reserve. "That made the difference. Knowing you were here waiting. Knowing you'd care if—" "Hush." Clara found herself cradling his face, thumb gentle on the bruised jaw. "You came back. That's all that matters." "Is it?" He caught her hand, pressed it flat against his chest, where she could feel his heart beating steady and strong. "Clara, I need to tell you." "Boss?" Pete burst through the door, then skidded to a stop, taking in their position. "Oh, sorry. Just the boys are buying drinks at the saloon, wanted to know if you're coming." Wade never looked away from Clara's face. Tell them I'll be along directly." Pete backed out grinning. The story would be all over town within the hour, but Clara found she didn't care. Let them talk. She'd faced down gossips and storms and the terrible possibility of another loss. Town whispers seemed small in comparison. "You were saying," she prompted softly. Wade stood still, holding her hand against his chest. "I was saying that I've been dead for 5 years, going through motions, building walls higher than any storm could knock down. Then you arrived with your grief and your courage and your stubborn refusal to give up. And suddenly, I remembered what living felt like." "Wade, I'm not asking for promises," he continued. "Not asking you to forget Thomas or pretend the past didn't happen. Just asking if maybe when you're ready, you might consider building something new. With me." Clara thought of the silk upstairs of the Christmas dance, coming of all the reasons to say no. She thought of Lucas's pretty letters and Thomas's quiet love and her own hard-won independence. But mostly, she thought of Wade's hand in hers during the storm, of the way he looked at her like she was something precious, but not fragile, of how different honest words felt from beautiful lies. "I'll make the dress," she said finally. "And I'll go to the dance with you. The rest, we'll see what tomorrow brings." His smile was like sunrise after storm. "That's enough. That's more than enough." He kissed her forehead, gentle as blessing, then headed for the door. "The boys really are waiting. But Clara, that key, keep it. Whatever happens between us, I want you to know you have a place, a choice. Always." After he left, Clara stood in her workshop, one hand pressed to her forehead where his lips had touched the other, clutching the key that meant more than mere metal. Through the window, she could hear singing from the saloon, Wade's men celebrating their leader's victory and their own survival. Tomorrow, there would be new challenges. Reynolds wouldn't forget the gossips would have fresh fuel. Winter was coming with its own trials. But tonight, Clara May Donnelly allowed herself to hope that perhaps after all the storms and losses and hard-won lessons, she might have found something worth rebuilding for. Not a fairy tale, not a pretty promise, just a good man and a strong woman and the possibility of something true. It was enough. It was everything. The dress was nearly finished, sage honey silk falling in graceful folds, each stitch a meditation on possibilities when the accident happened. Clara was pressing the final seam when Widow Patterson burst through the workshop door, her face white as January snow. "It's Wade," she gasped. "There's been an accident at the mill. They're taking him to Doc Morrison's now." The iron fell from Clara's nerveless fingers, burning a brown mark into the pressing cloth. She didn't remember grabbing her shawl or running through the streets. She only knew that her feet carried her to the doctor's office, where a crowd had already gathered. "Let me through," she said, and something in her voice made the crowd part. Pete stood by the door, his young face grave. "Ma'am, maybe you should wait." "Let me through, Pete." Inside, she found chaos. Wade lay on the doctor's table unconscious, his face gray beneath the tan. Blood soaked through makeshift bandages on his chest and shoulder. Doc Morrison worked with grim efficiency while Charlie held a lamp steady. "What happened?" Clara moved to Wade's other side, taking his limp hand without conscious thought. "Logging chain snapped," Charlie said, voice rough. "Caught him across the chest, knocked him into the saw platform. He hit his head pretty bad." "Need more bandages," Doc Morrison muttered, not looking up from his work. "And someone to hold him steady when he comes to. This is going to hurt." "I'll do it." Clara shrugged off her shawl, rolled up her sleeves. "Tell me what you need." For the next hour, she worked beside the doctor, holding Wade still when he stirred changing blood-soaked bandages, trying not to think about how still he lay, how shallow his breathing seemed. The wound across his chest was deep but clean. The chains had struck with terrible force, but missed vital organs by inches. "He's lucky," Doc Morrison said, finally washing his hands in a basin of pink-tinged water. "Another inch to the left, and we'd be measuring him for a pine box. As it is." He shrugged. "Head wounds are tricky. He'll either wake up or he won't. Nothing to do now but wait." The crowd outside had grown. Through the window, Clara could see half the town keeping vigil. News traveled fast in Cedar Hollow, and Wade Callahan was respected, if not loved, by most. She recognized Mrs. Bentley in the crowd, even Lucas hovering at the edges, and wondered if they'd come to gloat or genuinely cared. "We should move him somewhere more comfortable," Doc Morrison said. "The boarding house?" "No." Clara surprised herself with the firmness of her response. "Take him to his room at the station. His men will want to help watch over him, and he'll rest better in familiar surroundings." Doc raised an eyebrow. "And you'll be nursing him there alone with rough Cowboy's Mrs. Donnelly. Think of your reputation." "My reputation can go hang itself." Clara was already gathering supplies. "That man has stood by me when the whole town whispered. I'll not abandon him now for fear of gossip." They made a strange procession, Wade unconscious in the back of a wagon, Clara beside him, half the town following like a funeral that hadn't happened yet. At the station, Wade's men took charge with surprising gentleness, carrying their boss to his room, setting up a rotation of watchers. The room was simple but clean: a bed, a washstand, a trunk, and on the wall, a photograph Clara tried not to stare at. A pretty woman with kind eyes and Wade's smile. Mary, forever young, forever watching. "I'll take first watch," Clara said, settling into the chair beside the bed. "Ma'am." Old Ben started to protest, his own arm still in a sling from Reynolds's attack. "You don't need to." "Yes," she said simply. "I do." The men filed out, leaving her alone with Wade and the ghost on the wall. Clara wrung out a cloth in cool water, gently cleaning the dirt and blood from his face. In unconsciousness, the lines of strain eased, making him look younger, more vulnerable. "Don't you dare die," she whispered, smoothing dark hair back from his forehead where a purple bruise bloomed. "Don't you dare leave me now when I'm just starting to believe in tomorrow again." Hours passed. Clara changed his bandages, spooned water between his lips. When he stirred, talked to, filled the silence. She told him about the dress waiting in her workshop, about the Christmas dance only 3 days away, about how Minnie had smiled when Clara asked to borrow her pearl earrings. "I was going to tell you at the dance," she continued, holding his still hand, "that I'm ready. To build something new, like you said. To stop looking backward every time I take a step forward." Her voice caught. "But you have to wake up to hear it. Please, Wade. I've buried one man I loved. Don't make me bury another." Night deepened. Pete brought her coffee and sandwiches she couldn't eat. Charlie offered to spell her, but she refused to leave. Somewhere past midnight, exhaustion overtook her and she dozed in the chair, her head pillowed on the bed beside Wade's hand. She woke to fingers tangled in her hair. "Clara!" His voice was rough, confused, but blessedly alive. "What? Where?" "Don't move." She sat up quickly, blinking away tears she hadn't realized were falling. "You're at the station. There was an accident at the mill. How do you feel?" "Like a mountain fell on me." He tried to shift and gasped at the pain. "How bad?" "Bad enough." She helped him sip water, noting with relief that his eyes were clear, tracking properly. "Doc says you're lucky to be alive. The chains missed anything vital, but your hard head took quite a knock." "Explains the headache." His fingers found hers squeezed weakly. "You've been here all night." "Where else would I be?" He studied her face, the drawn features, the sleepless eyes, the tenderness she couldn't hide. "Your reputation is my own concern." She smoothed his blankets with her free hand, needing something to do. "Besides, someone had to make sure you didn't sleep alone. You asked me once not to remember." "That's not what I meant." "I know what you meant." She met his eyes steadily. "And this is my answer. I won't sleep without you again, Wade Callahan. Not if I have a choice in the matter." His face changed, pain forgotten in wonder. "Clara May Donnelly, are you saying—" "I'm saying you need to get well." She tried for stern, but couldn't quite manage it. "There's a dance in 3 days, and I've made a dress, and if you think I'm wearing sage silk for anyone but you, you're still addled from that blow to the head. Come here." When she leaned closer, he lifted his hand, trembling with effort, to cup her cheek. "Want to make sure I'm not dreaming." "You're not dreaming." She turned her face into his palm, pressed a kiss there. "You're alive, and you're going to stay that way, and we're going to have that dance and whatever comes after." "Whatever comes after," he repeated, eyes already drooping as exhaustion reclaimed him. "I like the sound of that." Dawn was breaking when Pete found them Wade sleeping peacefully, Clara keeping watch, their hands clasped like a promise. The young cowboy backed out quietly, but not before Clara saw his grin. By noon, the whole town would know that Mrs. Donnelly had spent the night at the station nursing Wade Callahan back from death's door. Let them know Clara thought smoothing Wade's hair as he slept. Let them see that sometimes love wasn't about pretty words or proper courtship. Sometimes it was about showing up when showing up mattered, about choosing to stand beside someone when standing there cost you something. Mrs. Bentley arrived that afternoon, ostensibly to deliver soup, but really to survey the scandal. She found Clara in Wade's room reading aloud from a book of poetry Pete had found somewhere, Wade propped up on pillows, and listening with a besotted expression that would have been comical if it weren't so sincere. "Mrs. Donnelly," the older woman said stiffly, "I hadn't expected to find you here." "No," Clara marked her place in the book. "Where did you expect to find me? At home wringing my hands while a good man suffered alone? A proper lady would have sent inquiries, perhaps visited during respectable hours." "A proper lady," Wade interrupted, his voice stronger now, "would have let propriety matter more than compassion. I thank God every day that Clara's too improper to be proper." Mrs. Bentley's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish. Finally, she set down the soup with a sniff. "Well, I suppose if you're determined to ruin yourself, Mrs. Donnelly, that's your choice." "Yes," Clara said peacefully, "it is." After she left, Wade caught Clara's hand. "You know there'll be consequences. The proper folks might not hire you anymore." "Then I'll work for the improper ones." She squeezed his fingers. "I've learned something these past months, Wade. Reputation is what other people think of you. Character is who you are when nobody's watching. I'd rather have the latter." "And what's your character, Clara May?" She thought of the woman who'd stepped off the train months ago, desperate, grieving, clinging to false hopes. Then she looked at who she'd become, a businesswoman, a survivor, a woman who'd chosen love with her eyes wide open. "I'm someone who keeps vigil," she said finally. "Someone who shows up. Someone who's learned the difference between pretty lies and hard truths." She smiled, feeling lighter than she had in years. "Someone who's ready to dance again." 3 days, Wade said, touching the bruise on his chest ruefully. "Think I'll be ready by then?" "You'll be ready," Clara said firmly, "if I have to prop you up myself." And looking at the determination in her eyes, the devotion she no longer bothered to hide, Wade believed her. They'd dance at Christmas, reputation be damned. And after that, well, after that, they'd build whatever came next, one honest day at a time. The Christmas dance arrived with fresh snow and the kind of crisp air that made the stars look close enough to touch. Clara stood before the mirror in her room, smoothing the sage honey silk with hands that trembled slightly. The dress fit perfectly, each stitch a testament to hope renewed. "Beautiful," Minnie signed from the doorway, her eyes bright with unshed tears. She came forward, holding the pearl earrings she'd loaned, and helped Clara fasten them with gentle fingers. A knock at the front door sent Clara's heart racing. Through the window, she could see Wade on the porch, standing carefully, but standing nonetheless. He'd refused to let his injuries keep him from this night, though Doc Morrison had lectured him thoroughly about taking care. She descended the stairs to find him waiting in the parlor, dressed in his best black suit, the bruises fading but still visible above his collar. When he saw her, his face transformed with a wonder that made her feel like she was 18 again, untouched by loss and full of possibilities. "Clara May," he said softly, "you take my breath away." "Save your breath for dancing," she replied, but her smile gave away her pleasure at the compliment. The church hall glowed with lanterns and evergreen garlands. Half of Cedar Hollow had turned out dressed in their finest, ready to celebrate survival of storms of conflicts of another year on the unforgiving frontier. When Clara and Wade entered together, a hush fell over the crowd. Then Pete started clapping, joined quickly by Charlie and the other station hands. Soon others joined in, Widow Patterson Jacob, even some who'd whispered the loudest about propriety. Not everyone Clara noticed. Mrs. Bentley turned away with a sniff, and Lucas wouldn't meet her eyes. But enough, more than enough. "Shall we give them something else to talk about?" Wade offered his arm, a challenge in his eyes despite his careful movements. "Let's Clara agreed, allowing him to lead her onto the dance floor. They moved slowly, mindful of his healing injuries, but Clara hardly noticed the limitation. She was aware only of his hand warm at her waist, of how natural it felt to be in his arms, of how far they'd both come from their separate griefs to this shared moment. "I used to watch you," Wade admitted as they swayed to the fiddle music. "Before we properly met, you'd walk past the station on your way to Morrison's head high, fighting the wind. I'd think there's someone who knows how to stand against a storm." "And I used to wonder about the man who built that station," Clara replied. "Who kept going after loss, who earned such loyalty from rough men. I'd think there's someone who understands that survival isn't the same as living." "When did we stop just surviving?" Clara considered, her head resting carefully against his shoulder. "The night of the storm, maybe. When you said you were tired of being alone in bad weather. Or perhaps when you brought me that first bundle of mending and looked at me like I was a person, not just my tragedy. For me, it was when you told Lucas Wentworth exactly what kind of man he was." Wade's chest rumbled with quiet laughter. "Watching you stand there with fire in your eyes, refusing to be made small by his weakness, I thought, now there's a woman worth knowing." The song ended, but they stayed on the floor as another began. Around them, Cedar Hollow danced and laughed, celebrating the simple miracle of another Christmas Eve. Clara saw Jimmy still pale, but upright, carefully dancing with the schoolteacher's daughter. Old Ben sat with Minnie, communicating in gestures and smiles. Even Doc Morrison had brought his wife, the two of them moving with the practiced ease of 30 years together. "Clara," Wade said during a pause between songs, "I have something for you." He led her to a quiet corner, reached into his jacket pocket with his good arm, and withdrew a small leather pouch. Inside was a simple gold ring worn smooth with age. "It was my grandmother's," he said quietly. "She wore it for 53 years through war and peace, plenty and want. Mary never wore it, said it should wait for the right woman at the right time." He met Clara's eyes. "I think she would have liked you. I think she would have understood why I'm asking this now, when we've known each other only months, when people will say it's too soon, too improper, too everything they love to criticize." Clara stared at the ring, her throat tight with emotion. "Wade, I'm not asking you to forget Thomas. I'm not asking you to stop grieving what you lost. I'm asking if you'll take what we have, this understanding, this partnership, this refusal to let storms win, and build something lasting with me." She thought of the 47 letters that had brought her west, full of empty promises and pretty lies. She thought of standing on the platform, abandoned and afraid. She thought of all the ways she'd been broken and all the ways she'd mended stronger at the seams. "Yes," she said simply, holding out her hand. "Yes to building. Yes to lasting. Yes to whatever comes next." His hands shook slightly as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting all these years for this moment. This woman, this second chance at love that neither of them had expected. "When?" Clara asked, admiring how the gold caught the lantern light. "Soon as you're ready. Tomorrow if you want. Or spring if you need time." He cupped her face gently. "I've waited 5 years to feel alive again. I can wait as long as you need." "Spring," Clara decided. "When the world's rebuilding too. But Wade." She smiled, feeling young and old and perfectly balanced between her past and future. "I'll be moving my workshop to the station after New Year. If I'm going to be a rancher's wife, I should probably learn something about cattle." "You sure the men can be rough and the work?" "The work is honest," she interrupted. "The men respect you, which means they'll respect me. And I'm tired of measuring my life by what others think is proper." She touched the ring, still marveling at its weight. "Besides, someone needs to make sure you don't sleep alone." He kissed her then there in the corner of the church hall, with half of Cedar Hollow watching. Not a desperate kiss or a claiming one, but something better. A promise, a partnership. A recognition of two souls who'd walked through fire and chosen to build something new from the ashes. When they parted, Clara became aware of the silence. The music had stopped and everyone was watching. Then Minnie stood clapping her hands, and the only sound she could make, and the room erupted. Not everyone joined the celebration. Some faces showed disapproval, others calculation. But most seemed genuinely happy for two people who'd earned their second chance. "Spring wedding," Pete called out, already slightly drunk on Christmas cheer. "I call best man." "You can't call best man," Charlie argued. "That's Wade's choice."
"Actually,"
Wade set his arm around Clara's waist,
"I was thinking of asking Jimmy. Man who almost dies saving horses deserves the honor."
The evening continued with music and laughter, congratulations, and a few cold shoulders. Clara danced with Jacob with Pete, even with Doc Morrison, who gruffly told her she'd better keep Wade from any more accidents before the wedding. But always her eyes found Wade across the room, and always he was watching her with that expression of wonder, as if he couldn't quite believe she was real. Late in the evening, as the celebration wound down, Clara found herself on the church steps, with Wade looking up at stars that seemed to shine with approval. Snow began to fall gentle as blessings dusting his dark hair with silver. "No regrets?" he asked, pulling her close with his good arm.
"None."
She rested her head against his chest, feeling his heart beat steady and strong.
"You,
only that it took so long to find you." He pressed a kiss to her hair. "But then maybe we needed to walk our separate roads to appreciate the one we'll walk together." "Pretty words, Mr. Callahan," Clara teased.
"Almost poetic. Should I be worried?"
"My words are plain as fence posts," he protested. "I leave the poetry to you." They stood there as snow fell and Cedar Hollow settled into Christmas Eve peace. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, running a ranch, merging two lives, facing whatever the frontier threw at them. But tonight they had the promise of spring, the warmth of acceptance, and the knowledge that neither of them would weather storms alone again. "Merry Christmas, Clara May," Wade murmured against her hair. "Merry Christmas, Wade," she replied, twisting the ring on her finger and marveling at how something so simple could mean so much. Inside the hall, someone started singing Silent Night voices, joining one by one until the whole gathering sang together. Clara and Wade remained on the steps, two people who'd learned that love wasn't about pretty letters or perfect timing. It was about showing up when showing up mattered. It was about choosing to rebuild when staying broken would be easier. It was about finding someone who understood that the strongest things were often mended things beautiful at the seams where they'd been repaired. As the last notes of the carol faded into the snowy night, Clara looked up at the man who'd brought her mending and stayed to help her mend herself.
"Thank you,"
she said simply.
"For what?"
"For seeing me. Not the widow, not the scandal, not the woman who'd come west on false promises, just me." "Thank you," he replied, "for reminding me that my heart still worked. I'd forgotten till you." They went back inside, hand in hand, ready to face whatever came next. And if the gossips noticed that Clara May Donnelly wore a ring that hadn't been there before, well, let them talk. She had better things to do than worry about whispers. She had a life to build, a love to tend, and a future that promised to be nothing like what she'd imagined when she'd stepped off that train, and everything she'd never dared to hope for. In the spring, when wildflowers bloomed across the prairie and the world dressed itself in new green hope, Clara May Donnelly married Wade Callahan at the little church in Cedar Hollow. She wore her mother's wedding dress carefully mended and altered with her own skilled hands. He wore his best black suit and a smile that transformed his weathered features into something young and full of promise. And when the preacher asked if anyone objected, the silence was complete, because everyone could see this was right. This was earned. This was two people who'd walked through separate darknesses and chosen to build their light together. As they walked back down the aisle, as husband and wife Clara caught sight of the church window where someone had hung a new banner, she'd sewn a simple design of interlocking rings like chains, made beautiful like lives woven together by choice rather than chance. "No sleeping alone," Wade whispered as they stepped into the spring sunshine. "Never again," Clara promised, and meant it with every mended, strengthened fiber of her being. And in a frontier town where hearts broke as often as weather, where loss was common as dust and love was precious as water, Clara and Wade Callahan built something lasting, not from pretty words or false promises, but from truth and courage and the daily choice to face tomorrow together. It was, everyone agreed, a love story worth telling, rough and real and beautiful, as only mended things can be. Thank you so much for listening to this Wild West love story. I'm curious. Where are you listening from? Please share in the comments below so we can connect and discuss what touched your heart in Clara and Wade's journey. If you enjoyed this tale of second chances and frontier courage, please subscribe to Wild West Stories. 1850, give this video a like and hit that hype button to help more people discover these authentic stories of love and survival in the American West. Your support means everything, and I can't wait to share more stories with you.